Welcome to this Maths Made Easy video on statistical sampling. To start with, let's take a look at some important terms in statistical sampling. Now there are several terms used that we need to be aware of. So the first term that we need to be aware of here is population. Now this is the group of people or things that you wish to find out about. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to write each term as we go along. I'd recommend writing these terms down and making sure to take note of the definition. Okay, so just to remind you there, the population is the group of people or things that you wish to find out about. The next term here is what we call a finite population. And here, a finite population is just a population where you can count how many members there are. Okay, so the next term then, following on from a finite population, is an infinite population. So an infinite population here. Now this is a population where it's impossible to determine how many members there are. But be careful here, we just say this is, it might not be infinite in theory, but it's impossible to count. So for example, the number of stars in the universe there. The next term here is what we call a survey. And a survey is the method by which you find out about the population, such as observing the behaviour or asking questions. The next term here is census. Now, a census is a survey involving all of the population. Okay. The next term here is sample. And a sample is a small section of the population that has been chosen for a survey. The next term here is sampling unit. Now a sampling unit is the individual member of the population. And finally we arrive at the last term here, which is sampling frame. And the sampling frame is a full list of the sampling units in the population, and the sample will be selected from this list. Okay, so that gives us everything we need there for our terms in statistical sampling. Let's move on here to take a look at a representative sample. Now since we use a sample to make inferences about the whole population, the sample must represent the population. If a sample is not representative, it is called biased, and the errors that lead to it are known as sampling bias. So let's just know that. So sampling bias. Now there's three things to remember to avoid this. 1. We sample from the right population with no members of the population excluded from the sampling frame. 2. We select the sample at random. And finally 3 here, we make sure all members of the sample respond. Otherwise the absence of some chosen members could induce bias. More information about creating a representative sample can be found on the page Sampling Techniques, so be sure to check that out if you want more information regarding that. So that gives us everything we need there for a representative sample. And finally, let's take a look now at when to use a census or sample. So how do we know when to use a census and when to use a sample? Well, let's start by discussing the advantages and disadvantages of both. So if we start with a census here, and we start with the advantages, well, we can note straight away that one advantage here is that the information is accurate because it comes from the whole population. So we can say that it's accurate. Another advantage here for a census is that it's impossible to introduce bias. So impossible to introduce bias. Okay, so that's 2 advantages for a census. What about some disadvantages? Well, we have a few disadvantages we can note here. For a census, one disadvantage here is that it can be quite time consuming and it can take a lot of effort. So it can take a lot of time can take a lot of time and effort. Okay. Another disadvantage here is that it could be potentially quite expensive to perform. Okay, so could be expensive. Another disadvantage here for a census is that it could be difficult to ensure everyone is surveyed. Any missed members then risk introducing bias. Okay, so it can be difficult to ensure everyone is surveyed. We just know that here. Difficult to ensure everyone is surveyed. Okay. And finally here, for a census, one disadvantage is if the tested items are used up or damaged by the test, then a census would clearly be impractical. Okay, so we'll note here, could be impractical. Okay, so that gives us what we need there for our advantages and disadvantages for a census. Let's take a look now at a sample. So sample here. And again, let's think about some advantages and disadvantages here. So for an advantage, or some advantages, we can note straight away that it's faster, cheaper, and easier than a census. So faster, cheaper, and easier. Okay, so that's one nice easy advantage there. Another advantage here that we can say for a sample is that the only viable option if testing item uses up, or it's the only viable option we can say here if we're testing items, because obviously we don't want to damage all the items there. So again, it comes back to this point here of a census being impractical, it makes a sample more practical. Okay, so more practical when testing items. Okay. And clearly we do have some disadvantages for sampling, or samples. So disadvantages here that we can note. Well, one, we can say each possible sample will give different results. So there's going to be some variation between samples. So variation between samples. So that's one disadvantage. And another disadvantage here is that it's very easy for there to be some sampling bias. Okay, so easy for sampling bias to occur. Okay, so that gives us everything we need there when choosing to use a census or sample. And that concludes this Maths Made Easy video on statistical sampling.